We got home from church and heard a weird sound. Landon walked through the house and he said, "Dad, I think the toilet's running in the other bathroom." I got partway through the house and thought, there's no way a toilet is making that much noise. He said, "No, I think it's actually running in the vent." And I put my head down close to the door and realized that water was gushing under the house. So if anybody wants to go swimming, we have an in-ground swimming pool. Better hurry before it drains out. No diving, please, because there's only a little bit of clearance. I've never seen it before, but a shut-off valve, the top of it, the gate part of it, actually blew right out of the pipe, half-inch of water, making its great escape. Oh well. I got done fixing it. I went around and said, "You got it all done?" And I said, "Yeah." I said, "I'm glad it wasn't churchy church." Imagine the scene here. There's a large crowd gathered. There's a lot of peer pressure. There's high expectation. These boys could lose their job. They could lose their life. In fact, they could lose everything. Do you stand, or do you keep your mouth shut and go along with the crowd? That's where we left Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, as Nebuchadnezzar likes to call them, last week when we finished up. Tonight, we're going to continue with verse 20 and finish up the chapter, but as we read it, I want to back up to verse 19. So let's begin reading with verse 19, if you will. "Then was Nebuchadnezzar full of fury, and the form of his visage was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Therefore he spake and commanded that they should heat the furnace 7 times more than it was wont to be heated. And he commanded the most mighty men that were in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their coats, their hosen, and their hats, and their other garments, and were cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Therefore, because the king's commandment was urgent, and the furnace exceeding hot, the flame of the fire slew those men that took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down bound into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astonished. And he rose up in haste and spake and said unto his counselors, Did not we cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire? They answered and said unto the king, True, O king. He answered and said, Lo, I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they have no hurt, and the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the mouth of the burning fiery furnace, and spake and said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, ye servants of the Most High God, come forth and come hither. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came forth out of the midst of the fire. And the princes, governors, and captains, and the king's counselors, being gathered together, saw these men, upon whose bodies the fire had no power, nor was any hair of their heads singed, neither were their coats changed, nor the smell of fire had passed on them. Then Nebuchadnezzar spake and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants that trusted in him, and have changed the king's word and yielded their bodies, that they might not serve nor worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree that every people, nation, and language which speaks anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made a dunghill, because there is no other God that can deliver after this sort. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. Let's bow for a word of prayer. Father, this is an account of how you worked in the lives of 3 individuals who dared to stand up to this king and do what was biblically right. Not knowing for sure how you were going to work, just knowing for sure that you would work. Being willing to submit to your will. And they gave you an opportunity to show yourself strong on their behalf. And this account is a wonderful account of how you took a situation that was supposed to bring honor and glory to a heathen king, and you turned the tables and used it to bring honor to you. where it rightly deserves to be. Father, sometimes it's so very difficult in the midst of a trial to see clearly and to think clearly. But help us to be folks that live by faith in the Word and who regularly look for opportunities to magnify you. In Jesus' name. The reason I wanted to back up and read verse 19 is it kind of sets the stage, if you will, for the situation here. Nebuchadnezzar is really upset. I mean, I guess that's putting it mildly. He is so upset. His physical. Now you can just imagine somebody that's so upset they're just gnashing their teeth and their jaw muscles have a vein popping somewhere. I mean, you can tell the guy is mad. And he is no longer willing to give a second chance to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Instead, it is time to prove once and for all who's in charge here. And so we're going to pick up in verse 20, and I want to look at the expected consequences. I want to look at unexpected consequences, and then I want to look at the details and the difficulty of the deliverance of these young men. First, the expected consequences. He commanded the most mighty men that were in the army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and cast them into the burning fiery furnace. We're going to start with the king because the king is the one that reacts first. What are the consequences? Well, his pride has been injured and he is angry. And we need to be careful. Because when our pride gets injured and when we get angry, we are not thinking properly and we are not acting properly. And you see that he is not thinking right. He makes some poor decisions. The first poor decision that I want to remind you about, we ended with this last week, he's forgotten God in his life. Where is the statement at the end when Daniel has revealed the dream to him and he is just standing there in shock and awe as Daniel sits there and not only tells him what the dream means, but tells him in incredible detail the dream itself. And he apparently has forgotten how strong God was at that time in his life, and now that's all gone away. There's no consideration for God whatsoever. But can I also share with you that he has forgotten the past service and the benefits of Shadrach and Meshach? I mean, here are three men who have been promoted, and these three men have been faithfully serving him all of this time. We don't have recorded anywhere that there has been a problem in the province of Babylon. We don't have recorded that these men aren't doing their job well. We don't have recorded that there's problems under their leadership. And yet, as soon as this situation comes about, all that just gets chucked right out the window, because how dare you threaten my pride? How dare you not bow to this image that I have set up? He heats the furnace 7 times hotter, reckless regard for the safety of the individuals that are involved. Now, there's only 2 kinds of furnaces that this could have been. I personally think it was probably brick kiln used for building a lot of things. The only other thing it would have been to smelt iron or metal. Both of them work kind of the same way. You throw a bunch of fuel in, and then you use bellows or whatever to create a draft and get it to burn. 7 times hotter would have killed them faster, but I believe what he's doing here, he is no longer concerned about how much they are tortured or how long it takes them to die. The quicker they get off the scene, the better for him. But what he's doing now, remember, there's been a coup attempt on his life. And so he gathers together all these important people, and just outside of Babylon there in the province, and he sets up this big tall image in this plain, and the whole thing is designed for them to show not only the wealth and how widespread and all the different languages that would have been represented by these folks that are gathered, but they're also supposed to be showing, by bowing to this idol, their support of the king. And when you have 3 individuals who don't do that, he's put a lot of time and effort into setting this thing up, and now all of a sudden it seems like the plan's backfiring. Well, there's one way he can get it back. He can throw these guys into a fiery furnace there near the plain where all these folks are gathered together. And if you heat it up 7 times hotter, doesn't it kind of make a statement to all those folks that are around that the king considers this sin so egregious that it's 7 times worse than anything else he's thrown anybody into the fiery furnace over? He does some things that are unique here. He commands the most mighty men that were in the army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Why the mighty men? Actually, anybody would do. Where are they going to run? Where are they going to hide? There's military people all over the place. There's captains. There's leaders. It's not like they're just going to dip into the crowd and take off. By the way, in traveling from the plain to the king's palace would have been the best time to make an escape if you were going to, not after you are sentenced to death and carried back out there in front of everyone. I don't think Shadrach and Benny here are the kind that are running away anyway. Not by the way that they stand before the king and answer him. But a damaged reputation before all of these folks that are gathered is the result for the king. How many folks do you think he showed his temper to that day? How many folks are scrambling around trying to get this furnace as hot as the king would like it to be able to accomplish this thing? King doesn't look good in front of the people he is trying to impress. What about the expected consequences for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Well, they lost their job. They lost their reputation. And they got thrown into the furnace. So really, they lost everything. Right? I mean, at least that's how the story's supposed to go down. But let's look at some unexpected consequences. Start with me in verse 24. These guys, he binds them in their clothes. Now, it seems like a stupid thing, but actually in this day, when you committed someone to death, usually you stripped them off naked. You did that to humiliate them. You took away all of their identification. These gentlemen probably were dressed appropriate to their station. So we don't know what commanders they were in the province of Babylon, but they would have been wearing Babylonian garb, and they would have looked like they were officers of Nebuchadnezzar, because they were. And when you invite important people to a party like he has, they would have been wearing, what the military would call their dress blues. They would have dressed for the occasion. So it's interesting to me that he doesn't take that off of them before he casts them into the fire. It almost would have been a form of rejecting them. You could have been a leader. You could have been assimilated into Babylonian culture. Instead, we're going to strip you down naked in front of all these folks and cast you in humiliation into the furnace. Unexpected consequences. He decides instead to leave the clothes on, and I believe it's because God's going to use that, as we'll see here in just a minute. Look at verse 24. Nebuchadnezzar, the king, was astonished. Now, unexpected consequence, the king lost his temper. But he's also going to lose his best men, because he is in such a haste to get the job done that when they open the door of the furnace and they go to throw these guys in, it's like a backdraft situation. The fire is so hot out there that the heat wave rushes out and it kills the mighty men that are throwing Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the furnace. Now remember, I love contrast. And please don't skip over one important aspect right here. How is the flame so hot? How is the fire so hot that when it flies out of the door, it kills the men, drops them dead in their tracks, that are chucking Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in? But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego make it into the furnace. Isn't that interesting? The heat wave, here the guys are, and they're getting ready to toss them on the count of 3. Ready? 1, 2, they fling the door open. And these guys drop dead from the heat blast that comes out, but they have the strength to chuck these 3 men into the furnace. And God's going to spare them, as we find out. King lost 3 important men. He's lost a lot of respect. But can I suggest to you that one of the things that he lost that is an unexpected consequence is God gets more attention than the king does. Remember, he's gathered all these important folks together. He's spent a lot of money in the gold in this idol, and he's built this platform and this towering thing overlooking the plain. And he's gone through this big ceremony to attract all this attention. But as he throws these 3 men into the fire, the attention shifts from him, and a much more grandiose occasion occurs. I mean, these folks would have been talking about this throughout the whole empire of Babylon. We'll get to that in just a minute. The fire killed the mighty men, but not God's men. And I think the king is so astonished by this fact that it says he is astonished. And as he draws near to the furnace, he looks and notices, wait a second. Now that's an interesting term, right? Because isn't he the one that's doing everything? And here are all the counselors gathered around, and he looks into the furnace and he realizes that 4 people are walking around inside of it. Now that fire was so hot to kill his mighty men, but now there's 4 people in there. He knows full well he only chucked 3 in. I wonder if there's going to be some unexpected consequences, because these guys aren't dead. And if they're not dead, they're probably mad. And if we only threw 3 in and there's 4 walking around in there, what's the 4th guy going to do? So his response is interesting. He looks at the counselors and he says, did we? Now, if you're a counselor and you watched him get upset just a minute ago, you don't say, what do you mean we, white man? You say, true, O king, we did. When we really had nothing to do with it, right? I want you to notice something about these 4 individuals. Because what he says here is an incredible testament to how God works in the middle of a trial. He rose up in haste and he says to his counselors, now look at his response in verse 25. He answered and said, lo, I see 4 men, what? Loose. Doesn't matter how badly the world binds you up. God's intention for you as a Christian is that you are always loose. There is freedom in Christ. Not freedom to sin and do whatever we want to, but there is freedom in Jesus Christ. They are loose. They are not bound. They are unhindered. Despite their attempts to limit these 3 individuals, God turns them loose, and they are allowed to do whatever he wants them to do. The next statement that I see that is incredibly interesting is he says they are walking around. Why aren't they curled up in the fetal position scared to death? Well, why aren't they just standing still in there having a conversation? Why are they strolling around in the furnace? I mean, obviously it has to be a furnace that's big enough that 4 men could walk around in it. But doesn't it seem unusual that even though they have been freed from their bonds and they are standing there talking with what I believe is a theophany, a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus Christ himself, they're not standing there talking, they are walking around. I believe they're walking around to show the king, number 1, that they're unhurt and that they could walk. It would have been astonishing, right? I mean, he's standing there waiting for them to slowly start burning to death, and instead, they jump up and start exhibiting the exact opposite. They were inclined to walk. Why do you walk around? Because your mind is at ease, right? Unless you're pacing, but they're not pacing. It says they were walking around. They were enjoying the company. This morning I said, if all God wanted to do was save us from hell, then why did he come down to the garden and walk and talk with Adam in the cool of the day? And it's interesting to me that it says he walked with him and talked with him, because that is a picture of a relationship, personal interaction. Every time I think of this, I think about a couple walking down the street and they're holding hands. And it doesn't matter if they're 20 years old, 40 years old, 60 years old, 90 years old. You look at them and you say, man, I wonder what they have been through together. I wonder what they have shared in their relationship over the years. That's exactly the picture that Nebuchadnezzar gets when he peeks into the furnace and he sees these guys walking around, fellowshipping, communion. There's a relationship going on here. He meant it for the worst possible situation, and yet God says, wait a minute. Do you not understand that trials and tribulations sometimes are when our relationship seems to be the closest? Can you not think back over your life and remember a time where you desperately needed him? And you felt the closest to him that you've ever felt in your entire life. It's exactly what I believe is going on here with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And he is absolutely astonished as he peeks into this furnace and he sees it. I'm trying to destroy these guys. I'm trying to make an example out of these guys. I meant this for their hurt. I did everything I could to limit them and to destroy them. And yet they seem right in the midst of this horrible tragedy like they're enjoying it. What a testimony. Look at the next thing that he says. They have no hurt. You say, well, that doesn't seem like a big deal. But it is a big deal. Because what he is saying is, there is an act going on here that supersedes nature. Nature was revealed when the hotness of the fire killed the mighty men that chucked them in. And the fact that these three guys are walking around with a companion and they have no hurt means something is going on here that is beyond my control. It's beyond anybody's control. Actually, this supersedes any natural thing and defies explanation. Isn't that what God tried to do with Pharaoh? Absolutely. Isn't that what Jesus Christ tried to do over and over and over again with many of the miracles that he did? Come on. You don't believe that he is the Messiah, the Son of God? Look at the miracles that he performed. I mean, what else does he have? He walked on water. He raised someone from the dead. He healed how many various things? Turned water into wine. Read people's thoughts. He says the fourth is like the Son of God. Now, where in the world did he get that from? I'll tell you where he got it from. The natural conclusion to the situation is this has to be supernatural. If we threw three guys in and there's four guys walking around, if the fire was so hot to kill these guys, but these guys aren't hurt, in fact, they actually seem to be enjoying the stroll through the furnace, then something supernatural has to be going on here. Now, bear with me for just a second. This has to be a messenger of their God. If they refuse to bow to his God, why would his gods be intervening on their behalf? That makes absolutely no sense. Why would their pagan gods be intervening in Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego if Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego won't give them the time of day? So the king's putting all this together from his pagan viewpoint, and he looks at it and he says, well, wait a minute. If this isn't what normally happens in my life, if this isn't the result of something that I worship and I think could happen, then it has to be the result of a God that I don't understand. Can I suggest to you that that's what redemption is supposed to do every day? When you see a drunkard that is changed and transformed by the saving knowledge of Jesus Christ, and the Holy Spirit starts to work in his life to conform him to the image of Jesus Christ. We see this with the maniac of Gadara, right? Nobody wants to go near that guy because he's running around cutting himself. They try and chain him. He breaks the chains. He is a mess, running naked through the tombs, cutting himself. He is a mess. And no matter what society tries to do to change him, they can't. But when Jesus lands that day, he runs to meet Jesus and wants to know, what do I have to do with thee, thou Son of God? Now, fast forward. He casts the demons out. And when the townspeople hear of it, they come to see this Jesus that they've been talking about. And they find the man, important statement, clothed in his right mind, sitting at the feet of Jesus. Wrong response. They are so scared to death by what they see that they ask Jesus to leave. Do you know that the next time he comes back, there's already a church going in that area? You say, why? Because eventually, when they got over being scared, they saw this man transformed like nothing else could. That's exactly what we see happening here with Nebuchadnezzar and the crowd that's gathered. He walks up to them and he gives them a tender invitation to come out. Now, this is very interesting because the language betrays that. He is furious as he throws them in. But in verse 26 it says, Nebuchadnezzar came near to the mouth of the burning fiery furnace and spake and said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, ye servants of the Most High God. Whoa, 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 whoa. You remember what happened right before they chucked him in? And what God can hold you and keep you from my hand? Now all of a sudden he's like, oh yeah, you wonderful servants of the Most High God. He goes on. He asks them in pretty incredible language to come out. They don't have any hurt on him. He is shocked by the circumstance that's going on. He's angry when he chucks them in. He asks them nicely, come out, come hither. I want to have a chat with you. Now, don't miss the importance of the end of verse 26. Because when we get in trials and tribulations, most of the time, what do we beg God for in prayer? That it would end. Come forth of the midst of the fire. They came out from the midst of the trial. God did not spare them from the trial. He spared them in the trial. And I know that's difficult to remember, but a lot of times when life seems to be kicking us in the teeth and we're having a tough time, remember, God does not necessarily want to spare you from the trial. He brought the trial to conform us to the image of Jesus Christ and to bring glory to himself. But he does want to bear you through the trial. Look at the public reaction in verse 27. Now remember, there are a lot of people gathered together on this plain. The princes, the governors, and the captains, and the king's counselors being gathered together saw these men upon whose bodies the fire had no power, nor was a hair of their heads singed, neither were their coats changed, nor the smell of the fire had passed on them. There is a large, varied audience, and news is going to travel throughout the entire kingdom of Babylon what God did on this day, because 3 men were willing to endure that trial. They were willing to go into the furnace if necessary. Now, can I ask you a question? What if they had used one of the excuses from last week? Oh, we're a lot better off serving the king than we are dead, so we'll just bow. And would God's name and reputation have spread all over the place from their service in Babylon? No. No. Look at the testimony in verse 28. Nebuchadnezzar spake and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who hath sent his angel and delivered. That's the first thing. He asked, right? He asked when he was mad at them, what God can deliver you from my hand? Answer, powerful testimony. God can. God can. What God could forgive a sin of so-and-so? You can share your personal testimony. No one can argue with your personal testimony. Listen, Paul said, I am the chiefest of sinners. If God can save me, he can save you. He's trustworthy. His servants that trusted in him. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego went out on a limb. They stood for something. And you know what? God didn't let them down. God didn't let them down. God is trustworthy. But he goes on. God's authority is supreme. Look what he says. And have changed the king's word. Now you would think that Nebuchadnezzar would already know this from the dream and the interpretation. But now this is the second time God has to deal with his pride. Remember the theme for the entire book? God is in control. God is in control. I attempted to do something and God changed the king's word and yielded their bodies that they might not serve nor worship any God except their own God. Last testimony, only God is worthy of worship. Now the king tried to force everyone to worship out there on the plain. But can you imagine how many people were ready to worship willingly because of the testimony this day? I can't imagine the shock. Now let's back up to verse 27 because there's a couple of things here that we need to look at. Number one, fire had no power. The fire had no power. What do you mean it had no power? Well, there are 3 things here that describe the fact that the fire had no power. Number one, their hair wasn't singed. Now, I don't know about you, but if you've ever had flame blow up in your face or near you, usually one of the ways you know you had a close call is you start to smell funny, right? It doesn't take an intense amount of heat to start curling up the hair and burning it, and it reeks really badly. There wasn't even a singe spot. Ladies, you can do that with a curling iron, right? What about a furnace heated up 7 times hotter? And yet there isn't a single hair on their head singed? That is attention to detail. Their clothes are not burned. I mean, what if, he had burned their clothes off and they'd hopped out of that furnace naked? They're still alive, right? So what difference does it make? No, you don't understand. Attention to detail. How much attention to detail? There is no smell of fire on them. When's the last time you sat around a campfire making s'mores, you went back inside and you smelled like what? Smoke. You're around somebody who's smoking a cigarette and you smell like. It takes very little smoke whatsoever in any form to get on your body and you can smell like it. In fact, if the neighbor's burning leaves a few hundred yards away and you walk out of your house, you walk back inside and go, whoa, somebody was burning trash or burning leaves. I smell like These folks walked around in the middle of a fiery furnace and did not even smell like smoke. You say, what's the point? Well, here's the point, and it's a very important one. Are you listening carefully? God knows the littlest detail of any trial. And he is in absolute micromanaged control of all of it. But when's the last time it felt like that in the middle of your trial? Doesn't feel like that, does it? But that's the truth. These men got thrown into the fire, and they have no idea whether it's God's will that they live or die. All they know is that one way or the other, remember their statement? He will deliver us from your hand. Now let's look at the difficulty of the deliverance. Verses 29 through 30. Therefore I make a decree that every people, nation, and language which speak anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made a dunghill, because there is no other God that can deliver after this sort. First thing, God is glorified. We're talking widespread fame. Can you imagine the languages that the gospel goes forth because of this? There are people on that plane that can't even communicate with each other, but they can go back to their own people and say, wow, you should see what I saw at Babylon. There's protection for his people. You see what he says? I don't care where you are in my kingdom. Nobody says anything against God or against his people, or I'll hack you in pieces and make your house an outhouse. There's protection for his people. We look at verse 30. The king promoted Rakshak and Benny. They got better jobs, which means they had more power. They had more money. They had a better lifestyle. They are famous. They're rock stars, right? I mean, can you imagine when they go home that night, there were probably people lining up in the streets doing what? I would imagine they were sniffing them. Right? It probably got weird. There's probably some teenager trying to rip the hat off, to sell it on eBay. Shadrach's hat that he wore in the furnace. The very hat. It's human nature, right? But there's two other things that I want you to see before we quit. Number one, the king is still not a believer. Because he says, because there is no other what? He doesn't say he's the only God. He doesn't say he is the one true God. See, he's still trying to take God and fit him into his lifestyle in a comfy, cozy way, which is what millions of people are doing today. They don't want to come to God on God's terms. They want God to come to them on their terms. And it's sad. I don't believe he is a believer yet. But there's something else that I want you to think about tonight that's equally as important. And here's the question of the day. What if God had chosen to be glorified differently? What if God had chosen to be glorified differently? See, the danger is we read this account and we think that every single time we put our life on the line and we stand up for God and we get thrown into a fiery furnace in the world, that we're going to come out and we're not going to smell like smoke and God's going to show up on our behalf and everything. But wait a second. Do people that get cancer die from it? Do tragedies happen all the time? I had a friend that wanted to be a pilot, and he did. And he went down to Peru, and he was a missionary pilot. The government shot him down because they thought he was running drugs. Crazy mess up, and you say, wait a second, God, where were you? I mean, missionaries all up and down the Amazon River need that guy to fly supplies in and out. And now he's in a hospital in the United States fighting for his life. It doesn't make any sense. Where's the Cinderella ending? But what if God chooses to glorify himself differently? Go back with me real quickly to verses 17 and 18. See, nowadays, there are a lot of denominations that try to manipulate God, the wealth and prosperity gospel stuff. God's like a slot machine. You put your faith in, ching, 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 and then you pull the little arm and presto, God pops out a certain thing because he is bound to do so. But look at verses 17 and 18. This is the answer that these three young men give to Nebi Baby. If it be so, our God whom we serve, number one, is able to deliver us. He will deliver us out of thy hand, O king. That's faith. But if not, wait a second. That tells us where they had faith. You see, nowadays you have all kinds of people. You go to a healing ceremony and the person gets whacked in the forehead. They flop like a fish on the stage. Where are they 30, 60, 90 days later? Dying from whatever disease they thought they were cured of. And the answer from the person who stands up there in the suit is, you didn't have enough faith. Hogwash. Dumbest thing I've ever heard. These men don't have faith in faith itself. They have faith in God. Now listen. What they said to Nebuchadnezzar is, our God can deliver us. We believe our God will deliver us today. We just don't know how he is going to do it because he has a will and our will is not superseded by some magical faith thing. Our will is superseded by the will of God. We'll see how he chooses to deliver us. Maybe we die today. We're still delivered from the king. There are a lot of movies out where, if you just have enough faith, you get a brand new truck and this and this and this and this and this happen in the end. And while I like to watch those movies, and sometimes they have a good point, that is not always the end of the story. We do not manipulate God. We submit to God. Now, can I suggest that the greatest example of submission to God was in the Garden of Gethsemane? Jesus did not want to face the cross. And it is concerning him to the point, it is burdening him to the point where he is sweating drops of blood because the corpuscles in his head are bursting. And blood and sweat are oozing out and running down his face. And the statement that he makes should be the statement that we make all of the time. Not my will, but thine. Do you remember the verse we started off this morning with? In the ages to come, he might show his glory. See, the problem is we think that we can manipulate God, and if we have enough faith, then God is bound to act on our behalf. But can I suggest to you that just because he pulled off this incredible miracle on behalf of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the end could have been far different, and God still would have been glorified, and the purpose still would have been accomplished? You don't always get the fairy tale ending. We have to allow God to be God. Remember, in the midst of a trial, that God knows the littlest detail of any trial, and he is in control of it. You can come through a trial and not smell like smoke, and not have your clothes burned, and not have your hair singed. And what if he chooses to glorify himself differently than what we had planned? Can you still take him at his word? Do you still trust him? Do you still think that he is able and that he will deliver? Are you willing to have faith in His will? That's what this passage is about. Let's bow for a word of prayer. Father, sometimes you do some miraculous things on behalf of your people. But there are other times that you seem to be strangely silent. John was in exile on the island of Patmos for a long time before he wrote the book of Revelation. Paul languished in prison for years, and you used it to write much of the New Testament. Stephen was a man that was willing to stand up, a deacon in his church, a leader. How much could he have accomplished? And instead, he is taken outside the city and stoned. And we look at it and you say, why? 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 He had his whole life ahead of him. How much could he have accomplished for you? When the answer is, he accomplished everything you asked him to. So although it is difficult, help us to realize, not my will, but thine. For you are always in control. But help us to be comforted in the midst of our difficulties, knowing that you are paying attention to seemingly insignificant details, and you are in control of all of it. And for that we praise you, we worship you, we love you. Help us to make your name great throughout the kingdom. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.